Hi, and welcome to Journey Forward with Jory Rose, where you will gain insights, tools, and inspiration to get unstuck and live your best life. Jory is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a passion for helping people cultivate awareness and authenticity so they can show up fully in all aspects of their life. And now, here's Jory.
Hi, and welcome back to Journey Forward with Jory Rose. I'm super excited today for my interview guest. It is Faith Harper. Faith, hello. Thank you so much for being on. Please tell our listeners who and what you are and all about your awesomeness.
Oh, okay. Well, now I have to make myself sound really cool. Okay, I'll try my best. Like you mentioned, my name is Faith Harper. I am a licensed professional counselor, board advisor. I'm based in San Antonio, Texas. I have postdocs in sexology and clinical nutrition. And a lot of my work has
on the gamut: sex, nutrition, therapy. You're covering all bases. I love that.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of my history really, comes from trauma therapy and past childhood incidents and how we're, getting over that and doing better in adult life. And really everything does tie back to that. It does sound like this very weird gamut of stuff that I do, but really all of it ties back into helping people kind of find emotional wellness. And a lot of times it's really hard to say, hey, you know what, you should try these breathing techniques to manage anxiety when your body is full of inflammation, and there's something we could probably do about that. Or, we need maybe more practical skills because it's affecting your sex life in some way, and there's more information about that. So I sound like really, really nerdy, and I kind of am, but a lot of it ties
I think
back
that's awesome.
into sort of breaking cycles and finding ways to live our best lives by, kind of attacking the problem from as many angles as we can.
I love that. And it's so in alignment of the work that I'm trying to do. I don't have any postdocs or, not as many degrees, but I think that concept of coming at it from multiple angles and to try to understand what's the process here? Where's this coming from? Where can I be most curious about what's showing up today? One of the things that I was so excited to talk with you about today is, as I am in my relationship that I have been for now over 3.5 years, and being in my 40s, I bring a whole new level of consciousness and awareness into the relationship process. And I find the entire thing fascinating. I mean, I actually was with my ex-husband since I was 13 years old. So even as a young kid, as I was at that time, relationships always fascinated me. And there are so many layers that can contribute and not contribute to a relationship being successful. And one of your books that I have read is Unfuck Your Intimacy, which I love the title. And tell us more about what gave you the idea to really unpack and uncover what is in the way of being more intimate in our relationships.
Yeah, the book came about. I did a TED Talk several years ago called Sex, Shame, and Silence, a TEDx San Antonio talk, which was a very cool experience. And people were like, oh my God, you should write a book. And I'm like, oh my God, I'd love to write a book. And I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah.
But when I thought about it, I realized that there wasn't, the books on the market out there were either like very sort of cis, hetero, Judeo-Christian kind of normative that a lot of people felt left out of.
Could you explain to our listeners what cis is, if they don't know?
Yes, cis cisgender, meaning that your assignment at birth, when we come out, the doctor goes, oh, it's a vulva, it's the girl, or oh, it's a penis, it's a boy, and making those sort of presumptions. And a lot of the books also make the presumption that it is a one male and one female relationship, and there's lots of other ways of being in the world. And that was kind of frustrating. I saw over and over and over, working in community mental health, people seeing themselves not represented in the literature. Like, we're trying to do the 5 love languages, which is the most amazing tool. I love it. I'm not disparaging at all. I wish I had come up with it.
Yeah,
but,
me too.
But when you're taking the quiz, and I remember having to sort of hack them and make them more, using more gender neutral language and stuff, so people didn't have that microaggression of feeling left out. And so that was frustrating for me. And then there was, the other extreme where it was hanging from the inverted cross and needle play, which is also awesome. but is, very, very specific type books. And there wasn't a lot of middle ground where the rest of us are. And I wanted something that really sort of encompassed all the ways that human beings are in the world, and taking a lot of the shame and stigma out of how we have relationships and how we express ourselves sexually, and just have like a lot of information about all these so much of what I do is psychoeducation, and you probably run into the same thing where I'm like, no, that's super normal, and people are like, what?
Wait,
And so even
I am normal? Yeah.
I am normal. I'm like, you're like the third person today, like it's all good. I'm saying things like, no, there is no DSM diagnosis for sex addiction. You may have a problematic relationship with how you're engaging in sexual activity, but it doesn't exist the way we think of addiction. And so let's go back and reframe that. And, and talk like, what, there are people that are out there that are ace or demi or gray sexual and have a different relationship with a sex drive than other people. And that's normal. And so I wanted people to see themselves in this book. And I wanted to give good tools. Like there's stuff in there that comes from sexology and sex therapy, like the sensate focus exercises, but there's also the emotional work of it, better communication skills. It really is kind of like, here is, kind of like the coverage of all, as much as I know, and trying to blend all of that together and have anybody who picks up the book feel like seen and represented.
Well, and and you take some information in there that could be really heady and hard to digest, and it's super fun to read. So if anyone's listening going, oh wait, that sounds like a lot, how do I unpack that? It's such a fun read, and your languaging that you use is really lighthearted. And so you're taking these topics that I think could be difficult for people and making it really accessible. So I really appreciate that approach as well.
Yeah, and I should warn all of your listeners that if you don't like cuss words, don't buy my books.
Yeah.
I write how I talk, and I think fuck is a perfectly cromulent word. It's in the title. That's fair warning.
Yeah.
And so in order to make things accessible and make ideas easier to understand, I do use, I literally, like, this is how I talk. All my clients will tell you, this is how I talk in session, and I write the same way. So it's not about trying to sound hip or cool. It's about taking ideas and making them digestible, because the more we can sort of enjoy the conversation and laugh at the situations that we're in, we can understand, and embrace our situation.
Yeah. Well, and I love how you're showing up so authentically, because it also role models to the people you're working with or reading. How can they show up authentically as well? We don't have to fit into this box or this framework of I'm supposed to be X, Y, and Z, right? So it's, I think in you being you is helping people allow themselves to be them.
Exactly. And I've had a couple of people over the years saying, oh, well, you're trying to sound hip. And don't you know that you're a middle-aged lady? And, and my clients think that's hilarious. I had a client like fall off my sofa laughing. She's like, you're the unhippest person I know. And I'm like, I know, right? So, it is very much exactly how I sound. And I want people to, if your language is like, I'm not really quite sure how to handle this, those are your words. And if your language is, boy, this is fucked up, what do I do with this? Those are your words. Yep. And it's important to be able to express ourselves sort of the way we're conceptualizing these problems and be heard and understood.
Yeah. And, so I want to delve a little bit further into the intimacy piece, because so many of the clients that I work with, and I've experienced it in my personal life, it is such a challenge to feel really seen, heard, and validated. And there's so many factors that can contribute. And, some of the things that I often see is we have really old stories that may have been rooted in early childhood, in previous relationships that we're still believing. And it's hard to differentiate when those old stories are old or when they're actually present, and there's just so many layers to it. And when I was with my ex-husband for a total of 23 years, met when I was 13, started dating at 14, got divorced at 36. And while it was a very easy relationship and we got along super well, we literally never fought, but it lacked depth and it lacked the intimacy that my soul was craving, which of course showed up in various areas. And so in being conscious in a relationship, and I tell my clients too, like a lot of the skills and even what you're talking about in your books, these are learnable skills. You don't have to have started off like this to be able to end up like this or to be like this in the moment. It takes the awareness and attention and intention to say something's not working. Let me be curious about that. where can I gain the skill to communicate my needs effectively, or to understand or differentiate, is this a past issue or a present issue? How do I even be able to name that? What does that feel like? How is it affecting us, in our sex life? How is it affecting us in me being able to be open and vulnerable? So it's kind of more of a commentary rather than a specific question, but what were some of the things in your work with clients that you see as some of those biggest barriers to intimacy? I know you talk a lot about trauma, and you're sort of being trauma informed. So maybe even in part of your response, help define what trauma actually is, because I think it's one of those words that can be easily overused and yet carry a lot of weight, and people might not know how to use that in relationship to what's showing up for me right now.
Right. And, and my background was, I was working with co-occurring disorders, and, my research was actually on intergenerational trauma and how that was sort of.
Okay, we're going to go back to that topic, because that's a whole other question I want to ask you about after we're done with this.
Okay. So, parking lot for now, but, it was about co-occurring disorders and how that, that came about from intergenerational trauma. So that was my research. Super fun at parties. What do you do? Trauma and sex. So, and what I noticed that
everyone's either going to love you or hate you at parties, right? Either I'm staying away from you,
actively avoid me, or they have so many questions.
Yeah.
And when I was running trauma-informed care groups, and I kept seeing that it was coming up in people's sex lives. And I remember having this conversation when I had this holy shit moment. This is something I need to go back and study, because it was not something that was in my graduate school programs. Was I said, how many people have had sober sex? I was a co-occurring disorder group, and only one person in the entire group had ever had sex sober. And I'm like, okay, this is a thing. And that's sort of where learning more tools to work with sexual intimacy in this very mindful way came from, because those were not tools that I got in my master's or doctoral program. But, trauma, first of all, is an injury to the nervous system. It's anything that overwhelms our ability to cope. It's something that we hold in our bodies. It's very much a somatic experience as much as it is a mental and emotional one. And my first book, Unfuck Your Brain, is really about how trauma wires, and like why we have, like, if, for those of you who have been diagnosed with PTSD or been told that you don't qualify for a diagnosis, we have these very specific rules about what qualifies as a traumatic event and what qualifies for a diagnosis. And I think that we hurt people in that process, and we diminish people's experiences. I've had people who have had what I would absolutely call a traumatic event. And if you heard their story, you would agree, but that would not qualify. It would not qualify them for that diagnosis. It would not qualify them in most systems for trauma-informed care. And so everybody's experience is valid. And so it doesn't have to be like this big horrific thing to have wired you to be fearful and overprotective, and for you to go into that fight, flight, freeze mentality in certain situations, and to understand where that's coming from. It really is the body's protective mechanism. It's not a sign of weakness. It's how bodies survive. And we have these very sort of primitive bodies living in this very modern culture, and the things that helped keep us alive don't really work anymore in 2019. Right. And so we're sort of dealing with that on this regular basis, and realizing where that's coming from and working with that. And then when we add the sexual intimacy skills, like what are things that we can do that in a somatic way with ourselves, with a partner, sort of rewire those processes. And I've had clients say, I'm like, you're going to cuss me out. You're not going to like doing the Sun-State focus exercises. You're not going to like doing Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent. You're going to think this is dumb. You're going to be laughing. You're going to be like, I fucking hate that bitch and I'm never going back. Right. Do it anyway. Like we're rewiring your connections. We're teaching you how to be mindful and vulnerable with a partner. And it feels dumb and simple, but wait, it's going to blow your mind.
Yeah.
And so that, that kind of work is really, creating new pathways in the brain, despite whatever got us to where we are. How can we be more vulnerable and authentic later? So it's not just about the like the conversations of, and we do that too. A lot of it is, like how to communicate better. I teach everybody communicating with I statements. This is like, welcome to Faith Office 101.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel blank when you blank. What I want is blank. And if we taught communicating with I statements in kindergarten, you and I would not have jobs.
Yeah, I know.
Some of those basic things. I talk about, that book talks about the 4 levels of communication and where we get stuck. And so we can be mindful of those processes and and I talk in the book, like I get stuck between 2 and 3. My husband gets stuck between 3 and 4. And these are things that we have to watch in ourselves.
Yeah.
And then how does that go into that in that physical sense of then how do we express ourselves in a sexually intimate way, when we're using the communication skills, and then what other tools do we put into it and also deshaming, destigmatizing just all the different ways human beings are sexually. Like there's no one way to like be a sexual human being. Like there's no standard for that. People are people-y, we're weird, we like what we like, and there's evolutionary reasons for why people are into what they're into, which is like a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But so much of it is like, that's normal. If you're into feet, you're into feet. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're not, doing things that are, inappropriate and against the law and all those other things. And, stigmatizing what we're into, like just, that's not trauma reactive. That's just early coding. And it's okay, and it's normal. And a lot of like validating, because there's a lot of shame and stigma if you're not, having heterosexual sex in the missionary position on Father's Day and the 4th of July, or like, whatever the rule is right now, then you're doing it wrong. You're being perverted and you're being fucked up. And so we have to, destigmatize that part of the process too, and let people explore an authentic sexuality for themselves and with partners.
Yeah. And even if someone hasn't had, a traumatic experience, it could just be some little thing that happened on the playground, when the kid was young, that made them have a certain mindset about themselves that is afraid to express how they feel. I mean, so even something that, would not fit into that box or category of trauma, but we hold on to our old stories so pervasively. And, when I started dating John, one of the things that I said to myself I was going to do was, let me just see what happens if I actually say how I feel. And it was like this little game I played with myself, not, a dating game as far as, mind games. It was just within myself, because I had to look at it as a game so I could keep it lighthearted and not be too attached to the outcome. But I had been in a practice of not expressing myself for fear it wouldn't be seen, heard, or validated, or acknowledged, or responded to in a way that made me feel like it was going to move the relationship or the situation forward. And I decided I want greater intimacy. I need greater vulnerability. I need to be me unapologetically. And so to have the courage to say, I'm going to say what I feel and let's just see what happens. And wow, what an amazing difference. And it took a lot of courage to be able to do that. But I think from that foundation, it's been able to build huge levels of intimacy and vulnerability that I've never experienced before. And I know John hasn't either. And it's so interesting when we can stay in that mindset and framework of curiosity and compassion, how much easier it is to be able to show up authentically with all of our baggage, all of our stories, and say, this is me. And I know, John and I, we hate this about ourselves, but yes, in fact, we are still human. And despite the fact that we teach all these tools and have been educated and trained in this similar area, we still get stuck. But what we do have is the ability to be curious in the moment, maybe not in the exact moment, but soon within the moment, to be able to say, what's going on here? And is this, again, is this an old story coming up? Have you been triggered with something that brought up, something from your past? And for us to explore each other's, it's that unpacking that for us is super exciting. For others, they have no idea where to begin. And so I think coming from that curiosity and compassion to explore that deeper, what's that block in our way? Because it does show up in every which level of the relationship. And I see this, and it's fascinating to me that I would say about half my practice is women, a quarter are couples, and a quarter are men. And one of the things that I have seen a lot is men who cannot orgasm during sex. And, they don't make the connection of maybe there's something in the relationship occurring and where they feel not, ability to be vulnerable or to be intimate or to be seen. And they just think, oh, I just can't come. It's like, well, let's maybe be curious what's going on there.
Yeah, and I love how you said curiosity, because I have that conversation with people all the time. We have a tendency to label, especially those uncomfortable emotions, as bad. I'm angry at my partner right now. Well, that's bad. You shouldn't be angry. Versus going, oh, what's up with that? Like, is this mine? Is this his? Where is this coming from? Maybe my husband actually did something that was a little dickish, but my reaction was way more than it needed to be. And being really curious about how I got to that, that I'm angry thing versus like, don't be angry, or exploding all over him, neither of which are really good ways to handle the problem. And just like, what's up with that? And, having the sense of humor with myself. I'm like, oh, am I on my bullshit right now? What am I doing? And, and that's the mindfulness practice. And I tell people all the time, try it, go learn it in a formal way. Nobody's going to shave your head and make you wear saffron robes. You can have, you can have a very devout religious practice that a mindfulness training is not going to threaten.
Right.
And
absolutely.
If you don't have a religious practice, mindfulness training is not going to become that for you. Like, nobody is going to say, and now you're Buddhist. It is very much just about learning your own process. I call it, in one of my books, I call it cockroach hunting. Like, when you sit down and start paying attention to stuff, it's very shocking. Like, if you ever turn, and I live in South Texas, so we have water bags. If you turn on the light and you see a roach, that there's like 50 more behind the wall, or 5,000 more behind the wall. And so when you start being mindful and you start going, I'm saying fucked up things to myself, you realize you're doing that all day long. Yeah. You're saying really negative, horrible things all day long, and we can't eradicate the cockroaches until we see them. It's flipping the light into our own experience so we can find the roaches.
Yeah, it's got to start with that awareness coming from a really self-compassionate place, right? Because I think that's one of the roadblocks to some of that intimacy is we don't have the self-compassion to be able to own our shit when it comes up. We want to keep externalizing it and blaming it. And it's really hard to own it when it's uncomfortable, or even to be able to say, you know what, I did screw up here and I did overreact. And that's not easy for us to do because it can be really shame inducing. And I think that's so important for people to recognize, again, you are human. This is natural.
Congratulations. Still human, not perfect yet. Who'd have thought? And then there's the other end of it too, and the people who think they really have to beat themselves up into submission, which also doesn't work. Compassion is that middle ground of, taking responsibility, but also recognizing your humanity in the process. I have a client, I remember the first time he called me to set up an appointment, he said, I need therapy, I'm a piece of shit. And I'm like, probably not a piece of shit. I'm pretty sure that generally speaking, people are not pieces. He's like, nope, but I totally am. And it became a running joke because I believe you're not, and I'm going to hold that space for both of us until you believe me. And he's like, yeah, whatever, I'm a piece of shit. And I had him say
those exact same words to my client, Faith. I told you that we have very small languaging. I say those exact words. You're not going to believe it right now, but I'm going to hold the space for you that it's possible. So
yeah. And then they kind of look at you. Yes. And they kind of look at you like,
hear that, right? Yeah.
Yes. Like I got this for the both of us until you're with me. And I had him read Kristen Neff's book on self-compassion. He's like, okay, read the book, doing the self-compassion thing, still a piece of shit. I'm like, you're not doing the self-compassion thing if that's still your label. And, we worked in, he wasn't in therapy too long. I worked with him for a few months. And then I remember like when he had maybe I'm not a piece of shit. Maybe I just kind of fucked that up because I wasn't paying attention and I was just, doing the shit that I'd seen in my life, and I can make different choices now. And I'm like, oh my God, you're ready to graduate. You recognize that you're not a piece of shit. And, and he had to have that because he really thought that calling himself a piece of shit was going to keep him from making mistakes again. And that doesn't work either. And, you know, and Dr. Neff's research has demonstrated that over and over, like that we can't beat ourselves into submission, and we can't hide from our own shit either. I had a client who said it beautifully recently, different client, he said, I want that to be the worst thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
I want to learn from, I want to own it and learn from it. And then like, and we'll make new and different and interesting mistakes. But he's like, that, I want that to have its place of being the worst thing I've ever done. And I know better, and now I do better. And I liked that way of looking at it, of owning it and seeing it as a place for growth.
And let me have compassion for the fact that I probably will screw up again, and that's okay too, right? In new and different ways. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We're going to fuck up in new and different and interesting ways, and we learn from it, and we say, congratulations, still human. Now get off your bullshit and figure it out. Make amends where you can make amends, and learn from it and try to human better in the future. Yeah. And I think part of the key there, if for couples who, might be listening to this now and says, this all sounds great, but we're so stuck in a pattern that we can't get unstuck from that pattern. And for those who are in that experience, I think both Faith and I would say, okay, but we will hold the space for you that it's possible you'll get out of the pattern, but it takes the awareness, desire, and intention to learn the skill of how to get out of the pattern. And I think that's where couples really spin. And I think many couples, I'm a believer that if you want to get divorced, get divorced. I have no issue with that. I don't think everyone's meant to be together forever. But I also feel like some couples actually could really make it work if they were able to just have the self-compassion to say, let me look at myself, let me look at us, and let's learn some new skills. Because a lot of it, one of the things I always say is love isn't enough. And it's about, whether it's your needs aligning, it's about how you step towards each other in times of conflict. It's about where are you willing to learn and grow together and on your own to say, I need to do it differently now. It's not working. And here's where it's showing up. It's affecting our sex life. It's affecting my health. It's affecting my stress levels. It's affecting my communication. It's affecting my relationship with my kids. You name it. It's not going to be easier with someone else necessarily.
Right. And even if you're, you may end up getting divorced, having done therapy and trying things in the process is probably going to, my experience has been that makes the divorce easier. I've sort of become a divorce doula in some cases. Yep. And you're also learning how to do it better the next time. So you don't just go find the same partner in another body and you do the same shit over and over.
Create the same patterns. Absolutely. You can have a better experience of the divorce if that's where it ends up, of going, hey, we really tried, and we're like, this isn't going to work, and we can, love the shit out of each other and not be able to do this with each other. Yeah. And that's okay too. Like Cheryl Strait says, sometimes you have to be brave enough to break your own heart. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I feel like I could talk to you about this for hours, but I have a couple other things that I want to talk about because one of the things you mentioned earlier was the transgenerational trauma. So speak to that for a moment, and in what you've done either in your research and your experience, how to help people break those patterns that keep showing up throughout generation. And this is something that just in my personal life, I'm so fascinated by. And I'm determined to break some of those transgenerational traumas that have been handed to me on a silver platter. And just to give you context, because I'm making this part of my story, and I've talked about my story on the podcast before, but aside from being Jewish, which comes with its own transgenerational trauma for centuries, but my mom's parents were killed in a car accident when my mom was 16. The accident was 55 years ago. She was the only survivor of the accident. And, it's interesting you were saying in the beginning about PTSD. She only really realized, honestly, a couple months ago that she has PTSD from the accident. Like, she's the first time she's given herself permission to even use those words. Not even permission, maybe just even awareness. But with, some major family trauma, I feel like there's been patterns that got inherently passed on to me, rightfully so. I understand it, so I never got angry at it because I always understood where the fear and anxiety came from. But when there has been something specific as a family trauma in the past, how do you go about breaking those transgenerational patterns to not prevent those traumas from reoccurring in future generations?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the big thing for people to know is this is a literal thing. This isn't us being woo-woo and trying to align our chakras here. And when I did my dissertation research, this was considered this was fucking weird. And I had fights with, IRB over it. And now everyone's like, yeah, this is a thing. Like, it's been studied in fruit flies, and it's been studied in rats, and it's been studied in human beings. The traumas that are experienced by our ancestors turned on certain epigenomes to prepare us to protect ourselves later. And those epigenomes, those turned on epigenomes, then are passed down. And they've been able to show this, like, very specifically in rats, where, like, shocking them and, giving them a certain smell. And then, like, the children of the rats may never be shocked, but they're going to freak out at the smell. That it's a protective mechanism. It's something that most species have in order to survive. It's a survival instinct. And, you mentioned being Jewish. My husband is Jewish, and his grandmother was a survivor of Auschwitz.
Wow.
And that's in a population where you could see directly the trauma and seeing how that's actually changed epigenetic structure. And my father is Choctaw, so it's something that we've also seen in populations that are indigenous to the Americas, and the enormous amount of traumas that colonization has created. So those are actually, like, the two big populations where you can see, like, this very direct lineage of how trauma has impacted, further generations. That we're having this survival reactive response to things that our ancestors have gone through. And, it's not even just from mother and father to child. We can see it back into grandparents and stuff, and it gets passed down and passed down. But if we know that it's an epigenome that's turning on, that means that we can turn it back off. And so that's where the research is now, which is really cool, because the brain has enormous capacity for new growth, throughout our lives. And so by being aware of going, oh, that's what I'm doing, we can start creating new paths. And I love Pema Chodron, the Buddhist monk, talks about this. We have this path that we've gone down. We have these epigenomes sort of light up and we respond to, and we're having this depression and anxiety response that actually belonged to an ancestor that we're now wired to have, of recognizing that and going, oh, that's what I'm doing. And she said the old paths never kind of go away, but they start to weed over.
Yeah.
As we start going down the new path, and intentionally it's going to feel awkward and weird, and we're kind of having to clear brush and create this new path, and we start creating, like, literally these new structures in our brain. It becomes easier and easier to go down that path, because it's harder to go down that path. The old path gets weeded over. It becomes harder to go down. We recognize it when we're doing it. We're like, oh, I'm on my bullshit. We get off. We go back. And it's about practicing and creating these new ways of being. And that seems to be one of the biggest ways of turning off those structures and not passing that down to future generations. And my thing is, like, this is where it stops.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to do this anymore. I can do the work for myself, and also so I'm passing down this work. And so rather than being resenting of, like, what the fuck? And I grew up with all these, these really insecure attachments and all the, these fucked up ways of being, of going, okay, yeah, that happened. This is where it stops. It stops here. And that's very powerful work. And that's the work that changes society. And it's not just for our own benefit. Those are the things that change society, by having us be mindful and be accountable, but also giving ourselves some self-empathy and self-compassion in the process. And I love your story about your mom. I had a very similar realization just like a couple years ago. And, like, I am middle-aged. So, like, in my 40s, I was going to pick up my son, and there was a big windstorm, and I was waiting in the dirt and gravel parking lot, and all this stuff was swirling up, and I just about lost my shit. Like, I'm sitting, like, having a panic attack over this. And I had the aha moment that as a baby, like 9-10 months old, my mom had been caught in a tornado in Amarillo, Texas, and had to get out of her car and get under an underpass with me. I don't have any recollection of this. I was a baby, but my brain knows. and was, hearing that noise and encoding that response, and these genomes lit up and turned on in me to be afraid of these noises and these sounds of something that I have no conscious recollection of.
Yeah.
And the fact that, something that she had just kind of told me in this passing, like, oh yeah, you were in a tornado. And she's like, what? And so, what I did is like, oh, that's what I'm doing. And I actually got out and took a video and was sort of like following this windstorm around and like just kind of being with the experience and like just super excited that I recognized what was going on. So I have that initial response when it hits now, but I have a different relationship with it. And the activation dissipates very quickly and I don't go into fight, flight, freeze mode.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm thinking of this, my biggest fears and my biggest pet peeve, I can trace back to both things happened when I was in utero. And honestly, like I have a huge, I won't say huge, it's gotten much smaller. I used to have a huge, it's now minor, but still I get activated. I have a fear of elevators. Like I would walk a lot of flight of stairs before I go in an elevator if I had the choice. And when my mom was pregnant with me, the last 2.5 months of her pregnancy, while they were finishing a house being built, they lived in an apartment complex, and she got stuck in that elevator all the time. And, the other one was literally when she was driving on the way to the hospital when I was about to be born, there was a major rainstorm, and it was, she said, terrible, terrible rainstorm. Windshield wipers are my biggest pet peeve. Like it activates an anxiety in me. I will literally lean over and turn it off on people if they have it going too quickly. And it's just been funny because I've always known those are two in utero experiences. I have no conscious memory, and I've never, knock on wood, been stuck in an elevator. But those are real experiences. I get it. And so when I look at the bigger patterns and some of the things that, I joke and I say that I have had fear and anxiety handed to me on a silver platter. Like that's how I grew up. That was, the world was a scary place. And for a lot of, there's, I go back further and there's more family trauma and family history of death and tragedy. Like it's real. And I made a conscious choice when I was pregnant of, I don't want to hand that on to my kids. And part of it was, how do I stop the anxiety response as it comes up so I don't pass that on? And it started when I was pregnant to really shift the energy in my body. So it's, not everyone's going to have that level of awareness in those moments, but I love that the research says this is not just woo-woo shit. This is real. It's possible. And while we might be wired towards it, doesn't mean we have to be that way forever.
Right. And by making those changes for ourselves, we're also passing down those changes, not just behaviorally by modeling, but, literally changing our genetic structures, and we're passing down those changes as well. Like for what you talked about, besides the epigenomes, your mom flooded her uterus with cortisol. And so you had that experience. Like the windshield wipers for you is probably the audio more than the visual of it, because we do still hear things in the womb. Like all of those things are very, very real. And so a lot of times we feel really embarrassed or ashamed or dumb about our responses, but it's our brains trying to keep us alive, saying this is scary and not okay.
Yeah, and I was actually almost born in the car. My mom had me 30 minutes after she got to the hospital. So that cortisol was probably extra high.
Yeah. Yeah, and so like when you're aware of it, you're like, oh, there it is. That's my thing. I know what to do with this. I know what, skills work for me. I know how to be mindful in the moment. I know how to ground myself, and when you go to therapy, you're practicing those skills and kind of figuring out those connections with the therapist and practicing. I say, amateurs practice until they get it right. Experts practice till they can't get it wrong. So you're practicing. So when you're activated, you use your tool. On Tuesdays, we wear pink. And when we're activated, we use our fucking coping skills, and so it just becomes the thing that you do. And, it may never turn off completely. I mean, research shows that for fairly simple PTSD, like being in one car accident, for example, and having a traumatic reaction to that, you can see sort of a complete recovery. But for these more complex events, it's not a complete recovery. But we know what it is, and we have a different relationship with it. And that also is a form of healing, and it's okay. Cause I'm like, wait, is this ever going to get better? I'm like, you're still going to have a good life, and you're going to be able to have a different relationship with it. And I don't have, cause I also do hypnotherapy in my practice. When people are like, can't you hypnotize this out of me? And so you have to go into like, what hypnotherapy actually is and the subconscious actually is. And the short answer is it doesn't go completely away. I'm just putting skills in deeper. And
Right.
it's okay. So being mad at yourself for not making it go away is you're setting yourself up for failure, and you're setting yourself up to continually beat yourself up, which is also not helpful to the process, versus going like, I'm human and this is what we do.
Right.
And having self-compassion for this, this imperfect human form.
Because I think people just want to be happy. They want to feel connected. They want to be happy. They want to feel good about themselves. They want to have good relationships. They want to be good parents. They want to have great sex. And that's not too much to ask for. It feels like it, but I will hold the space that it's possible. You hold the space that it's possible. So, just believing it's possible, I think, helps people step towards that.
Oh, absolutely. And it totally is, because I'm a terrible liar. I don't even bother. If I think that I'm not in a place where I can help somebody, I send them to somebody else. So if I'm like, we can do this, we've got this, then I believe that. And I know that you work the same way. So if you have a therapist, like, no, we got this, we can do this. We by law cannot take your money if we can't help.
Yep.
So if we're telling you that we can, unless there's like really horrific and unethical, we can help. And
yeah.
you have to be willing to do the work as well. I say, I can't work harder than you. I'll work my ass off and I'll work as hard as you, but you have to be working just as hard with me. And also don't expect it to happen, necessarily right away. If it took decades to create these patterns and generations to create these patterns, it's not going to be, magically better in, 6 to 8 weeks of prolonged exposure therapy, no matter what the VA says.
Yep.
That it's going to be ongoing work, and that may not necessarily be doing therapy all that time, but you're sort of having to do this ongoing practice. And I have clients that maybe bop in and see me a couple times a year, for a tune-up or when something happens, but they're using the skills consistently.
Yep. Well, I could talk to you for hours. I really could. There's so many other things, and maybe we'll have to have another conversation at some future point, because I never even got to one of the things I really wanted to go to, which was parenting and teaching sex positive to teenage daughters. So we'll maybe have another conversation about that, because I've got 2 teenage daughters who, are asking more and more questions, and I really want to be able to create the space for open communication. And I think I do, and yet I'm still noticing, this is really scary. So we might have to schedule another talk. So I know you said you have some other work coming out around parenting, so I'd love to help support you in getting that work out there as well. But for
Absolutely,
this conversation, this has been awesome. I really feel that the framework in which you're providing, and you've got so many resources in your books, and I know you've got like workbooks and different stuff online. So how can people find you? Because your realness is something that for many people is going to be a big breath of fresh air, because you're dealing with really heavy shit in a way that is really attainable and accessible. So how can people find you?
So my online handle, my website that kind of talks about where I'm going to be speaking at and my different books and stuff is theintimacydoctor.com, and that's DR, not DOCT. OR, so it's intimacydoctordr.com. And that's also my online handle for Twitter and Instagram, and I have a Facebook page. It's Intimacy Doctor as well. And my sort of very basic private practice page is faithharper.com, and they all link back and forth.
Perfect.
But,
and we'll have all this in the show notes as well, that people can find you and access. And again, your books are great. I think people would really appreciate reading them. And it is my intention to write books. And so I hope to be able to write in the voice that I speak as well, because I don't want to fit into anybody else's box of how I should write a book. So thanks for being a model for that for me.
Absolutely. And if you're speaking authentically, it's always going to work. And there may be people that are like, I don't like how you talk. And you're like, that is cool. But
that's me.
But 95 out of 100 people are going to be like, oh my God, I get it now. Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Faith. And I really appreciated your time today. And I know that everyone else will have gotten a lot out of these tools. And I do look forward to another conversation, because there's a lot that we didn't get to yet.
Absolutely. I can't wait.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
To continue your journey forward, find Jory Rose on Facebook and Instagram to become part of her growing community. You can also gain access to her meditations, books, online classes, or to sign up for an upcoming retreat, visit her at joryrose.com. That's JOREEROSE.com.